The order was already moving. It existed before anyone touched it, before it was read aloud, before it was understood. It traveled ahead of awareness, sealed in paper and procedure, copied cleanly and passed forward without alteration. Its language was precise, stripped of doubt, framed in certainty. There was no room inside it for interpretation. It did not ask to be believed. It did not invite discussion. It simply required motion. Ink dried. Stamps pressed down with practiced force. Carbon copies slid into folders. Each action repeated something done countless times before. Each gesture identical to yesterday's gestures, and the day before that. The order did not arrive dramatically. It appeared the way all legitimate instructions appear, quietly, formally, unremarkably. It was placed where such things are placed, among others that had already been fulfilled, and others that would soon be. It moved through channels built long ago, channels designed to prevent friction. Hands received it, not to evaluate, but to confirm. Eyes scanned it, not for meaning, but for alignment with format. The wording matched expectation. The signatures were correct. The sequence was intact. Nothing about it broke the rhythm of the institution that carried it. There was no moment where it could be stopped, no threshold where it waited for consensus. The system was not built to pause once initiation occurred. Each segment of the structure recognized the order only in the narrow way it was trained to recognize things. As valid or invalid, complete or incomplete. This one was complete. It passed downward, not because it was urgent, but because urgency was unnecessary. The machinery did not rely on haste, it relied on certainty. Each transfer was recorded. Each acknowledgement returned upward as proof of receipt. The order became traceable, documented, undeniable. It left behind a trail of confirmations that could not later be erased. No voice rose against it. None were expected to. The language of the order carried authority without naming its source. It did not explain its purpose. Purpose was assumed. It did not justify itself. Justification was implicit. The structure accepted it the way it accepted all things that arrived through the proper path. Time passed without resistance. The order did not decay as it moved. It did not soften or adapt. It remained exactly what it had been at the moment of its creation, immune to context, unchanged by distance. The system valued this stability. Alteration was considered a flaw. Consistency was the highest virtue. Those who handled it did so with the same neutrality they applied to every instruction before it. The same posture, the same tone, the same silence. It was treated not as a decision, but as a fact, something that already existed and simply needed to be enacted. By the time it reached its final recipients, it no longer felt new. It felt inevitable. It had been affirmed too many times to be questioned now. It carried with it the weight of the entire structure that had moved it forward, layer by layer, without interruption. The order had not yet done what it was meant to do, but everything required for its outcome was already in place. The environment that received the order was built to accept it. It existed long before the moment of its arrival, shaped by repetition and reinforced by absence of disruption. Walls, corridors, and workspaces were arranged not for comfort, but for flow. Everything had a place. Everything moved according to expectation. The system did not rely on inspiration or improvisation. It relied on continuity. Authority within this structure was not loud. It did not need to be. It was embedded. It lived in diagrams, manuals, schedules, and inherited habits. Every position understood itself in relation to another, and that relationship was fixed. Movement upward was reserved for reports. Movement downward was reserved for instruction. Nothing traveled sideways without being filtered first. The order entered this environment as one more element in a continuous stream. It did not disrupt the pace. It matched it. Those who encountered it did so in rooms designed for reception, desks cleared except for what was necessary, surfaces worn smooth by decades of identical tasks. The posture of those present did not change. There was no visible tension. The order was not treated as a burden or a threat. It was treated as routine. Hierarchy expressed itself through silence. Questions were not forbidden, but they were unnecessary. The structure had already answered them in advance. Training had reduced uncertainty to procedure. Every individual knew precisely where responsibility ended. Beyond that boundary, thought was no longer required. As the order moved downward, it passed through layers that existed solely to ensure accuracy of truth. Each layer confirmed not meaning, but fidelity. Was the wording intact? Was the sequence preserved? Were the conditions satisfied? The process did not ask whether the order fit reality. It asked only whether reality could be adjusted to fit the order. The chain of command was visible everywhere, but rarely spoken of. It appeared in how documents were handled, in who spoke first, in who waited. It appeared in the way information was framed, concise, impersonal, stripped of excess. Emotion had no function here. It did not aid clarity. It did not improve efficiency. Those positioned between origin and execution served as conduits. Their role was not to intervene, but to maintain momentum. Any delay introduced at this stage would be noticed. Delays were anomalies. Anomalies required explanation. Explanation implied deviation. Deviation implied failure. So the order continued. Meetings occurred, but none addressed the order directly. They addressed logistics, readiness, alignment. Each discussion assumed the order as a fixed point. Planning revolved around it without touching it. Alternatives were unnecessary because no alternative had been authorized. The system did not generate options unless instructed to do so. Language within the structure reflected this rigidity. Verbs were precise. Subjects were often absent. Actions happened without actors. Responsibility was diffuse, distributed across the framework itself. No single element could be isolated as decisive. The order belonged to everyone and no one. Compliance was not enforced through fear. It was enforced through familiarity. This was how things were done. This was how they had always been done. The system rewarded predictability, and predictability required obedience. Innovation was reserved for approved contexts. This was not one of them. As the order moved closer to execution, it became increasingly abstract to those who handled it. Distance removed consequence. The further one was from impact, the cleaner the instruction appeared. It was easy to accept its logic when only fragments were visible. No single layer held the entire picture. None were expected to. Each segment trusted the others implicitly. Trust was not emotional. It was structural. The system functioned on the assumption that every other part was performing its role correctly. To doubt that assumption would undermine the entire framework. So doubt was unnecessary. It had been designed out. The environment responded to the order by aligning itself. Schedules adjusted. Resources shifted. Personnel were assigned. All of this occurred without urgency, without debate. The system was efficient. It always was. Efficiency was its defining characteristic. What the structure did not possess was elasticity. It did not bend. It did not reassess once movement began. The order had crossed the point where alteration was possible. From here, only execution remained. No alarms sounded. No warnings were issued. Nothing within the system registered danger. The order was valid. The channels were clear. The hierarchy was intact. The machinery of command was functioning exactly as intended. Execution began without announcement. There was no single moment that marked its start. No signal that distinguished it from the countless actions that preceded it. The order did not arrive at execution as a dramatic command. It dissolved into tasks, each one small enough to appear harmless on its own. The system preferred this fragmentation. It reduced complexity. It reduced visibility. Schedules were followed. Timetables aligned. Movements occurred at assigned intervals, not because they felt necessary, but because they had been assigned. Coordination was precise. Each unit moved when told to move, stopped when told to stop, waited when told to wait. The order expressed itself through timing rather than words. There was no discussion of intent. Intent had already been translated into procedure. Those responsible for carrying out the order interacted only with the portion that applied to them. They did not seek context. Context was not required. Their responsibility was narrow by design, defined clearly enough to eliminate interpretation. Communication during execution was minimal. It did not need to be rich. The structure favored brevity. Messages confirmed position, status, completion. Language was standardized. Deviations were unnecessary. Silence filled the spaces between transmissions, not as tension, but as normalcy. Each action triggered the next automatically. Completion at one point activated movement at another. The system was interlocked. No single element could pause the sequence without authorization that did not exist. The order had already accounted for contingencies, at least on paper. Reality was expected to conform. Personnel involved in execution displayed no hesitation, not because they were fearless, but because hesitation served no function. They were not asked to judge outcomes. They were asked to meet conditions. The conditions were clear. The conditions were being met. Equipment was deployed as specified. Resources were allocated according to plan. There was no improvisation. Improvisation introduced variables were undesirable. Precision required constraint. The order demanded consistency, and the system delivered it. Checks were performed, but only to verify compliance. Measurements confirmed alignment with instruction, not alignment with circumstance. If something matched the order, it was accepted. If it did not, it was corrected. There was no mechanism for reevaluating the order itself. That stage had passed. As execution progressed, minor irregularities appeared, delays measured in minutes. Signals repeated once more than expected. Adjustments were made to preserve schedule, not to reassess direction. These were not interpreted as warnings. They were interpreted as friction, something to be smoothed out. Reports moved upward in their prescribed form. Each one stated that execution was proceeding as planned. This was accurate. The plan was being followed exactly. No report suggested deviation because no deviation had occurred. The system recorded success in real time, even as conditions shifted subtly beyond its assumptions. Those closest to the process experienced execution as routine labor. Familiar movements, familiar sounds, familiar sequences. The order did not feel extraordinary. It felt like work. The absence of drama reinforced confidence. If something were wrong, it would announce itself. That belief was structural, not personal. Coordination across segments remained intact. Timing held. Dependencies were satisfied. The machine advanced steadily. There was no need for urgency because nothing appeared broken. Everything essential was functioning. The order was proving itself through smooth operation. No one paused to ask whether the conditions that justified the order still existed. The system did not include that question. It had not been authorized. Authority had already spoken, and authority was not present here. Authority existed elsewhere, abstracted into text and signature. As execution continued, the order became increasingly difficult to interrupt. Each completed step removed options. Reversal required consensus that could not be assembled in time. The system did not resist change out of stubbornness, but out of design. It was optimized for forward motion. Silence persisted, not as ignorance, but as compliance. The absence of dissent was interpreted as confirmation. The lack of interruption signaled correctness. The structure read its own smooth operation as validation. By the time the first indications of strain became impossible to ignore, execution was already too far along to stop. The order was no longer a document. It was a process in motion. The first signs did not arrive as alarms. They appeared as discrepancies so small they could be absorbed without comment. A report that arrived later than expected. A confirmation that required repetition. A parameter that fell just outside its anticipated range. None of these were unprecedented. The system had encountered such variations before. It was designed to tolerate them. Execution continued. The order did not contain instructions for reinterpretation. It did not include thresholds for reconsideration. It described a sequence, and the sequence was being honored. When conditions diverged from assumption, the response was not to pause, but to compensate. Adjustments were made locally, narrowly, always in service of maintaining alignment with the original directive. As more data accumulated, patterns began to form. They were visible only in fragments, scattered across different segments of the structure. No single point collected them in full. Each layer saw only its assigned indicator, and within those limits, everything remained acceptable. The system did not aggregate doubt. Communication increased slightly, but its content did not change. Messages became more frequent, not more reflective. Status updates multiplied. Each one reaffirmed that the order was being followed. Each one reinforced momentum. The tone remained procedural. Nothing suggested emergency. There were moments when personnel encountered results that did not match expectation. These moments were brief. They were recorded, categorized, and filed. Anomalies were treated as temporary. The system had confidence in its own corrective capacity. It had corrected things before. The structure's rigidity became more apparent as conditions evolved. The order assumed a stability that no longer existed, but it continued to dictate action as if nothing had shifted. The system responded by forcing reality into compliance where possible, and by ignoring what could not be reconciled immediately. Warnings did surface, but not in a form the structure recognized as authoritative. They appeared as hesitations in data, as inconsistencies between reports, as quiet requests for clarification that moved upward too slowly. By the time they reached positions capable of acknowledging them, they were outdated. The order had advanced beyond their relevance. There was no single moment of realization. Understanding did not arrive as clarity. It arrived as accumulation. A growing sense that effort was increasing while results diminished. That more energy was required to maintain the same alignment. That the system was working harder to achieve less. Yet the response remained the same. The order had not been rescinded. No countermand had arrived. Without explicit reversal, continuation was mandatory. The structure did not possess authority to reinterpret silence as instruction. Silence meant persistence. As execution pressed forward, the gap between instruction and outcome widened. Resources were strained, not because they were insufficient, but because they were being applied according to assumptions that no longer held. Timing slipped. Coordination frayed at the edges. Still, the central sequence remained intact. The system began to display signs of stress, but it did not register them as failure. Stress was internal. Failure required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement required authorization. None had been given. Efforts to stabilize conditions intensified. Redundancies were activated. Backup procedures were engaged. All of these actions occurred within the bounds of the original order. They were not deviations. They were extensions. The system was doing everything it could to preserve obedience. At no point did anyone openly challenge the order itself. There was no forum for that action. The structure had not been designed to evaluate its own directives once they entered execution. It had been designed to fulfill them. As consequences grew more visible, the order's language remained unchanged. It continued to describe a reality that no longer existed. The system continued to act as if it did. The machinery of command moved forward, carrying with it the weight of its own inflexibility. The failure had not yet fully arrived, but it was no longer avoidable. Collapse did not announce itself as an event. It arrived as saturation. The system reached a point where correction no longer produced stability. Each adjustment created additional strain elsewhere. Resources diverted to address one deficiency exposed another. Timing collapsed inward, compressing margins until sequences that once operated independently began to interfere with one another. The order remained unchanged. Its language did not acknowledge escalation. It continued to demand completion. Signals that once flowed cleanly through the structure began to open. Reports contradicted one another, not in content, but in implication. Each confirmed compliance. Together they described incompatibility. The system recorded them without synthesis. There was no mechanism for collective interpretation at this stage. Interpretation had been rendered irrelevant by progress. Execution accelerated unintentionally. Delays triggered compensatory pressure. Pressure reduced discretion. Reduced discretion increased speed. The structure mistook motion for control. Momentum replaced coordination. The order was still being followed, but now it required force to maintain alignment. Failures began to cascade, not as explosions or dramatic breaks, but as withdrawals. Capacity disappeared from the margins first. Redundancy exhausted itself. Backup systems were activated and then depleted. Each layer consumed its reserves to satisfy the order's demands, unaware that others were doing the same. The structure had been designed for efficiency, not endurance under contradiction. Communication degraded. Messages arrived incomplete or out of sequence. Confirmation lagged behind action. The system attempted to compensate by increasing transmission volume, flooding its own channels with updates that could no longer be processed in time. Information lost meaning through abundance. The order did not adapt. It continued to require precision from a system that was losing resolution. Coordination gave way to simultaneity. Actions occurred together, not because they were synchronized, but because separation had failed. Dependencies collapsed. Units acted in compliance with instruction, but without awareness of the consequences unfolding beyond their immediate scope. Each component fulfilled its role perfectly. Together, they produced incoherence. The structure began to fracture along its boundaries. Interfaces between layers failed first. Handoffs broke down. Responsibilities blurred, not because authority weakened, but because authority had already been delegated too narrowly to respond to conditions now exceeding its frame. Loss accumulated without spectacle. Assets were rendered unusable not by direct destruction, but by misalignment. Effort was expended in directions that no longer contributed to outcome. Resources were committed past the point where they could influence results. The system continued to invest in completion even as completion receded. There were no heroic interventions. None were authorized. Initiative required permission that could not arrive in time. Those within the structure did what they were trained to do. They executed their portion of the order until it could no longer be executed. At the center of the collapse was not confusion, but clarity. Everyone involved understood exactly what was happening within their assigned scope. What they could not see was the totality. The system ensured that no single perspective ever possessed it. Collapse occurred not through ignorance, but through compartmentalization. As failure expanded, the order continued to function as reference. It defined success even as success became unattainable. The system measured itself against the instruction, not against reality. Reality was treated as a variable to be managed, not as a condition to be acknowledged. The moment when reversal became theoretically possible passed unnoticed. There was no marker, no threshold triggered recognition. By the time the structure began to register irreversibility, execution had already consumed the means required to stop. The collapse spread unevenly. Some segments ceased functioning entirely. Others continued with reduced capacity, unaware that their outputs no longer mattered. The system did not halt. It degraded. It persisted in fragments, each one still obedient, still aligned with the order, still moving forward. Loss manifested as absence, absence of response, absence of support, absence of coherence. The structure did not mourn these absences. It logged them. It adjusted projections. It revised schedules that could no longer be met. The order did not change. Eventually, execution reached its terminal phase not because the objective had been achieved, but because the system could no longer sustain action. Movement slowed, then stopped, not by decision, but by depletion. The order had consumed everything required to carry it further. What remained was not silence, but residual activity. Isolated actions continued briefly, disconnected from purpose, until they too exhausted themselves. The system did not collapse all at once. It collapsed in layers, each one failing according to its own constraints. When the final acknowledgments were recorded, they did not describe disaster. They described completion. The order had been followed exactly as given, and in doing so, it had brought the structure that obeyed it to the edge of ruin. Afterward, the system closed around the absence. There was no formal declaration that the order had failed. No statement marked the moment when consequence became undeniable. What remained were records, timestamps, confirmations, closures, assembled into a sequence that still resembled success when viewed narrowly. The structure did not deny what had occurred. It simply did not name it. Activity resumed. Offices reopened on schedule. Shifts rotated. Rosters were updated to reflect depletion, not explanation. Forms were amended to account for loss in neutral terms that described quantity without implication. The language remained technical, precise, and untroubled by meaning. The order itself was archived, indexed, and stored alongside others like it, indistinguishable in appearance from instructions that had produced no disruption at all. There were reviews, but they were procedural. They examined compliance, not premise. They traced execution paths, not assumptions. Each review confirmed that the order had been transmitted correctly, received properly, and enacted without deviation. This conclusion satisfied the requirements of the system. Nothing further was demanded. Silence settled into the spaces where discussion might have occurred. Not an enforced silence, but an inherited one. No directive instructed anyone to stop speaking about the order. There was simply no function for continued reference. Once execution concluded, attention shifted forward. The structure was oriented toward continuation, not reflection. Responsibility did not vanish. It diffused. It dissolved into the architecture of process, where no single component could be isolated without misrepresenting the whole. The order had passed through too many hands, too many layers, to belong to any one of them. Accountability required concentration. The system specialized in dispersion. Those who had been closest to the collapse returned to routine. They did not require instruction to do so. Routine was the default state. The environment reasserted itself. Desks cleared, channels reopened, schedules normalized. The absence of what had been lost became background noise, absorbed into planning margins and future projections. The order was no longer referenced by name. When it appeared at all, it did so indirectly, as a data point, as an entry in a report summarizing outcomes without narrative. Its consequences were expressed numerically, framed as variances, deficits, adjustments. Numbers traveled upward. They were acknowledged. They were contextualized. None of them altered the structure that had produced them. Training materials were not revised. Protocols remained intact. To change them would require recognition that the order itself had been flawed. That recognition did not occur. The system had functioned according to design. It had not malfunctioned. It had obeyed. Memory within the structure was selective. It retained what was useful for repetition and discarded what complicated continuity. The order's trajectory did not become a lesson. Lessons implied choice. The system preferred precedent, and precedent required neutrality. The order was treated as an anomaly, without cause. In time, personnel shifted. New positions were filled. Experience was transferred in fragments, stripped of context. What had been lived was not passed on in full. It did not need to be. The structure did not rely on recollection. It relied on documentation, and the documentation was complete. The environment returned to equilibrium, not because balance had been restored, but because imbalance had been absorbed. The system was built to absorb loss without altering shape. It adjusted parameters. It recalculated capacity. It moved forward. Somewhere within its archives, the order remained exactly as it had been at the moment of its creation. Its language unchanged, its authority intact. Nothing in the record suggested that following it again would produce a different outcome. There was no annotation, no caution, no mark to distinguish it from the rest. The channels through which it had moved remained open. They were ready for the next instruction. And when that instruction arrived, legal, official, Properly formatted, it would move the same way, through the same structure, with the same certainty, carried forward by the same obedience. The system did not remember the disaster, it remembered only that the order had been fulfilled.